Mark never imagined that his marriage would turn into something resembling a competition. But as he sat across from Olivia at dinner, watching the way she swirled the wine in her glass, he could sense that something had shifted. There was a calculated look in her eyes, a hesitation that made his stomach tighten. And then she said it. "I've been thinking." He knew from experience that nothing good ever came after those words. He kept his expression neutral, waiting, but his pulse had already quickened. "We've been together for 10 years and I love you, I really do," she continued, reaching for his hand. "But don't you feel like we've become stale?" He blinked. The word caught him off guard, but before he could respond, she rushed to explain. "Not in a bad way," she said quickly. "It's just, we have our routine, work, dinner, sleep. We don't really do anything new, even." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "Even when we're together, it's always the same. I just think maybe a little freedom could help us find that spark again." It took him a second to register what she was really saying. His fingers curled around his glass, tightening as his mind struggled to keep up. "You want an open marriage?" he said flatly. Olivia swallowed. "I think it could be good for us. No sneaking around, no lies, just honesty and transparency." He let out a short laugh, the sound more bitter than amused. "Honesty," he repeated. "So you want to sleep with other people, but instead of calling it cheating, you want permission?" Her face twisted with frustration. "That's not what I said." "That's exactly what you said," she sighed, shaking her head. "Jake, I don't want to lose you. I just think this could bring something new into our relationship. You could do it too. If you can." And there it was. The part she didn't say outright, but that he heard loud and clear. Olivia had already decided how this would go. She would explore her options freely, knowing men would line up for her. Meanwhile, she expected Mark to struggle, to sit at home, unable to find someone else. She thought she held the advantage. Mark felt something shift inside him. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. Instead, he met her gaze, calm and unreadable, and said, "All right, let's do it." For the first time since the conversation began, Olivia hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Maybe she expected him to fight harder, to beg her to change her mind. But Mark wasn't going to beg. If she wanted to play this game, he would make sure she lost. That night, they attended a family gathering at Olivia's parents' house. Laughter and conversation filled the room, but Mark was only half present, still reeling from what had happened. He was pouring himself a drink in the kitchen when a familiar voice spoke softly behind him. "So, I heard about your little arrangement." He turned to see Emma, Olivia's younger sister, leaning against the counter. There was something unreadable in her expression, something knowing. She wasn't exactly quiet about it, she continued, swirling her own glass. "She told Mom when she thought I wasn't listening." Mark exhaled, shaking his head. "Jesus." Emma studied him for a moment. "And you really agreed to it?" "Didn't seem like I had much of a choice." She smirked slightly, but there was something curious in her gaze. "So, what are you going to do about it?" He shrugged, keeping his expression casual. "Guess I'll just have to see what happens." For a second, she just stared at him, her lips curving into the faintest hint of amusement. "You know," she said softly, "Olivia always did underestimate you." And just like that, something shifted. Maybe Olivia thought she had the upper hand. Maybe she believed Mark would struggle while she thrived. But for the first time that night, he realized something. This game wasn't going to go the way she expected. The morning after their conversation, Mark watched Olivia move through their home with a new energy. There was a lightness in her step, a certain confidence in the way she hummed to herself while sipping her coffee. She was dressed more carefully than usual, tight black leggings, a fitted top that accentuated her figure. It wasn't for him. He could tell by the way she kept glancing at her phone, the way her fingers hovered over the screen before typing something quickly. "You're in a good mood," Mark said, keeping his tone casual. Olivia glanced up, surprised, but she recovered quickly, offering him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, I just have a lot to do today." "Like what?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before shrugging. Just errands. Mark didn't push, he already knew. She was setting things in motion, testing the waters of this so-called freedom. Probably downloading dating apps, lining up a date, making sure she had options. She had assumed this would be easy, that men would line up for her attention. She wanted to see how quickly she could replace him. But what she didn't realize was that Mark had no intention of being left behind. He wasn't going to sit around waiting for her to come home, expecting him to be the reliable fallback. He wasn't going to be the loser in this game. She grabbed her keys, pausing at the door. "What are you up to today?" He smiled as he lifted his coffee cup. "I think I'll just see what happens." The words were deliberate. He wanted her to wonder, to second guess, to feel even the smallest sliver of doubt. Her lips pressed together, but she nodded. "Okay, well, have fun." And then she was gone. For the first time in years, Mark felt something shift inside him. Control. The power dynamic between them had always been unspoken, Olivia always leading, assuming Mark would follow. But now, he had the upper hand. For the next few days, he watched as Olivia threw herself into her new experiment. She was constantly glued to her phone, her fingers tapping out messages with an excitement she didn't bother to hide. He caught her smiling at her screen more than once, biting her lip in that way she used to when they first started dating. She was careful, though. No names, no obvious changes in behavior. But Mark could see it, the thrill of the hunt, the way. She thought she was stepping into a world of endless possibilities. But there was one thing Olivia hadn't accounted for: Emma. It started small, a few extra texts here and there, simple, casual things. "Hey, can you help me move some furniture? This weekend? Just saw this new whiskey you'd love, sending you a pic." Olivia is crazy, huh? That last one was sent late at night. At first, Mark told himself it was nothing. Emma had always been friendly, always had a way of making him feel at ease. But this was different. This was subtle. A slow, steady trickle of attention calculated in a way that he couldn't ignore. And the truth? He liked it. Emma was different from Olivia. Where Olivia was polished, always carefully put together, Emma was effortless. She had long, dark hair that she never seemed to care much about, but somehow it always fell perfectly around her shoulders. She had a way of looking at him that made him feel like he was the only person in the room. So when she texted, "Olivia is crazy, huh?" He hesitated. Then, before he could overthink it, he replied, "You have no idea." The dots appeared instantly. "Oh, I think I do." Mark stared at his phone for a long moment, something twisting deep in his chest. This was dangerous. But wasn't that the point? Meanwhile, Olivia was struggling. She thought dating would be as simple as swiping right, choosing from a sea of men eager to worship her, but reality wasn't so kind. At dinner one night, she casually dropped a comment, fishing for a reaction. "Guys are so weird these days," she said, scrolling through her phone. "I mean, I match with a few, but most of them just want hookups. No effort at all." Mark took a slow sip of his beer. Shocking. She shot him a look, as if expecting him to say more, to reassure her, to tell her she was still desirable. He didn't. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You haven't been trying yet, have you?" she asked, her voice light, teasing. "Not really." She smirked as if that was the answer she expected. "Figured. You're not exactly the type to jump into something like this." There it was again, that same assumption, that she was ahead, that Mark was just waiting for her to return. He tilted his head, watching her carefully. Then slowly he said, "I don't know, Olivia. I might surprise you." Her smirk faltered, just slightly. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Mark saw it. Doubt. Mark had expected Olivia to thrive. She had walked into this open marriage with an air of confidence, certain that she would be the one winning, that she would be the one basking in attention while he sat at home, waiting. But reality wasn't matching her expectations. At first, she tried to hide it. She still went out a few nights a week, slipping on heels, dressing carefully, swiping through her phone with practiced ease. But something had changed. She wasn't coming home with that same smug energy. She didn't walk through the door looking victorious. If anything, she looked tired, frustrated. She wasn't finding what she thought she would. The excitement, the thrill. It wasn't as easy to capture as she had believed. Mark, on the other hand, hadn't been searching at all, and yet, without trying, he had found something. Emma. It started so subtly, so naturally, that it almost didn't feel like a choice. The texts between them became more frequent. "What are you up to? Did Olivia tell you about her latest date yet? She's always been a little full of herself." The words were light, but the meaning behind them wasn't. There was a pull, a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken yet undeniable. Then one night, Emma took a step further. "Hey, can we grab dinner?" Mark hesitated. This was the moment, the line, the place where he could stop this, where he could say no. But deep down, he already knew. He wanted to see her. He wanted to know where this would lead. So he agreed. They met at a quiet restaurant tucked away, the kind of place where people disappeared into corner booths where no one was paying attention. When he walked in, Emma was already there, sipping a cocktail, looking relaxed in a way Olivia never did. Her hair was pulled back, her dress was simple, effortless, but it did something to him, made his pulse quicken, made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. "Hey," she said, smiling. "Hey." He sat down across from her, feeling an odd sense of anticipation. It wasn't nervousness, it was something else. She leaned forward, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "So," she said, her voice teasing, "how's the single life?" "Treating you?" Mark smirked. "Not exactly single, am I?" She tilted her head. "Could have fooled me," he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Olivia's having a rough time." Emma let out a low laugh. "Yeah, I figured. She really thought this was going to be easy, huh?" She did. Emma shook her head, a smirk playing at her lips. She never really appreciated what she had. Something about the way she said it made Mark pause. He studied her, his pulse a steady, slow thrum in his chest. "What do you mean?" She hesitated just for a second. Then she leaned in slightly, her voice quieter. "Let's be real, Mark. Olivia wanted an open marriage because she thought she'd win. She assumed she'd have men lined up for her while you—" She trailed off, her gaze holding his. He swallowed. "And you don't think that's happening?" Her eyes flickered with something sharp. "I think she's losing." The air between them shifted. He could have laughed, shrugged it off, changed the subject, but he didn't. Instead, he let his gaze linger, let his eyes drift over her in a way that wasn't accidental. He let himself wonder, just for a second, what it would have been like if they had met under different circumstances. If Emma had been someone else? If he had been free? She bit her lip, hesitating. Then, barely above a whisper, she asked, "What if she loses you?" Something inside him cracked. He didn't think. He didn't stop to consider the consequences. He just reached for her. Emma inhaled sharply as his fingers brushed her cheek, trailing down to her jawline. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned into him, and then he kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't cautious. It was desperate, reckless, the kind of kiss that came with years of built-up frustration, years of feeling unseen. When she pulled back, her breath was shaky, her fingers pressed against her lips like she couldn't believe what had just happened. "Mark," she whispered. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. His mind was screaming that this was wrong, that they had crossed a line. Emma swallowed, her face unreadable. "We shouldn't have done that." There was no conviction in her voice. "I know." But neither of them moved, and that was the problem. That night, when Olivia came home from yet another failed date, Mark was sitting on the couch, beer in hand, watching her. She tried to act casual. "Hey." "Hey," he replied smoothly. She hesitated, expecting him to ask how her night went, to show even a flicker of jealousy, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned back, watching as her expression faltered. She sighed. "I went out with that guy I told you about." He raised an eyebrow. "The one from the app?" "Yeah, Jason." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "He was, not what I expected." Mark leaned forward, feigning concern. "Oh?" She let out a dry laugh. "You ever meet someone who looks amazing in pictures but in real life? There's just nothing there?" He smirked. "You mean like every guy on Instagram?" That got a real laugh out of her, but it was short-lived. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know. I thought he'd be charming. He was hot, I'll give him that. But the second we sat down, I don't know. He talked about himself the entire time." Mark took another sip of his beer. Shocking. She shot him a look, but didn't argue. She was starting to see it now. She had thought she would have everything: freedom, validation, a new sense of excitement. Instead, she was chasing ghosts, and she had no idea that while she was out failing, Mark had already been found. Mark sat on the couch, his fingers lazily tapping against his beer bottle as he watched Olivia move around the kitchen. She was avoiding his eyes, her usual air of confidence noticeably absent. A week had passed since she had started this so-called open marriage, and he could see it in the way she hesitated before speaking, the way she lingered just a little too long when she walked past him. She wasn't winning, and it was starting to weigh on her. She had come home late again, her makeup a little too perfect for someone who was supposedly just out with friends. She dropped her purse on the counter and exhaled, rolling her shoulders like she was trying to shake off frustration. Mark didn't ask where she had been. He didn't need to. He already knew the answer. "I went out with that guy I told you about," she said casually, but there was a forced lightness to her tone. Mark raised an eyebrow. "The one from the app?" "Yeah, Jason." She forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "He was, not what I expected." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Oh?" She let out a dry laugh. "You ever meet someone who looks amazing in pictures but in real life? There's just nothing there?" Mark smirked, taking a slow sip of his beer. "You mean like every guy on Instagram?" That got a real laugh out of her, but it was short-lived. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know. I thought he'd be charming. He was hot, I'll give him that. But the second we sat down, I don't know. He talked about himself the entire time, like the kind of guy who thinks he's doing you a favor just by sitting across from you." Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. Shocking. She shot him a look but didn't argue. He could see it now, the slow realization creeping in. She had thought she would be juggling men by now, basking in attention, making him jealous. Instead, she was dealing with ghosting, arrogance, and men who weren't nearly as interested in her as she had assumed they would be. The attention she had expected, the validation she had craved, it wasn't coming as easily as she had imagined, and she had no idea that, while she was out there failing, Mark was slipping further and further away. Because Olivia wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Sophie's name hadn't come up in conversation, but it was there, lingering in the spaces between their words. Mark's phone buzzed on the table, and he didn't even need to check to know who it was. Sophie wasn't obvious about it, but the messages were there, simple ones at first. "What are you up to? Olivia tell you about her latest date yet?" She's always been a little full of herself. The words weren't dangerous on their own. It was the meaning behind them that mattered. And then, a few nights ago, Sophie had taken things a step further. "Hey, can we grab dinner?" Mark hesitated. He should have said no. He should have drawn a line before it got too complicated, before it turned into something more than just stolen glances and unspoken tension. But deep down, he had already crossed that line. They met at a quiet restaurant tucked away, the kind of place where no one would be paying attention. When he walked in, she was already there, a glass of wine in front of her, her hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. She looked up at him and smiled, and for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he was truly being seen. "Hey," she said, her voice warm, easy. Hey. He sat down across from her, the weight of everything settling between them. They both knew what this was, what it could turn into. She leaned forward slightly, swirling her drink in her glass. So, she said, her tone teasing, how's the single life treating you? Mark smirked. Not exactly single, am I? She tilted her head, watching him. Could have fooled me. The words lingered. She wasn't wrong. Sophie was different from Olivia. Where Olivia had always been polished, always carefully curated, Sophie was effortless. Where Olivia had demanded admiration, Sophie simply gave it. She looked at him like he was worth something, like he wasn't just there to be tolerated, to be expected. And for the first time in years, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Wanted. Sophie let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. She never really appreciated what she had. Mark studied her, his grip tightening around his drink. What do you mean? She hesitated, then leaned in just a little closer. Let's be honest, Mark. Olivia wanted an open marriage because she thought she'd win. She assumed she'd have men lined up at her feet while you... She trailed off, her gaze holding his. He swallowed. And you don't think that's happening? Her eyes flickered with something sharp. I think she's losing. The air between them shifted. He could have laughed, shrugged it off, changed the subject, but he didn't. Instead, he let his gaze linger, let his eyes drift over her in a way that wasn't accidental. He let himself wonder just for a second what it would have been like if they had met under different circumstances. If Sophie had been someone else, if he had been free. She bit her lip, hesitating. Then, barely above a whisper, she asked, what if she loses you? Something inside him cracked. He didn't think. He didn't stop to consider the consequences. He just reached for her. Sophie inhaled sharply as his fingers brushed her cheek, trailing down to her jawline. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned into him, and then he kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't cautious. It was desperate. Reckless, the kind of kiss that came with years of built-up frustration, years of feeling unseen. And in that moment, Mark knew. Olivia had already lost him. She just didn't know it yet. Mark sat on the couch, his fingers wrapped loosely around a bottle of beer, as he watched Olivia pace the kitchen. She was trying to act normal, pretending nothing had changed, but he could see the cracks forming. The way she hesitated before speaking, the way her fingers tapped anxiously against the counter, the way she stole glances at him as if trying to read his thoughts. It had been 2 weeks since she proposed the open marriage, and the confidence she once carried had started to slip away. She had thought this would be easy, that she would be the one thriving, the one in control. She had assumed that men would line up for her attention, that she would come home glowing from new experiences while Mark sat here, waiting for her to return. But that wasn't what had happened. The reality of dating as a married woman wasn't as thrilling as she had expected. Instead of exciting new connections, she had found empty conversations, disappointing dates, men who saw her as nothing more than a passing amusement. Mark had watched her enthusiasm fade over the last few days. She no longer came home with the same smug smile, no longer dropped casual hints about the men she was talking to. Instead, there was frustration in her voice, a growing restlessness in the way she carried herself. She had expected this arrangement to make her feel powerful, but instead, it had only left her feeling more uncertain than ever. And the worst part? She had no idea that while she was struggling, Mark had found something she hadn't expected. Sophie. Addie. First, it had been nothing. Just a few extra texts, an unexpected conversation here and there. Sophie had always been warm toward him, more relaxed than Olivia's other family members. But lately, there was something else beneath the surface. A knowing glance, a lingering touch, a question that carried more weight than it should have. It was subtle, but it was enough to make Mark realize that Sophie wasn't just being friendly, and he wasn't just imagining it. Tonight, Olivia came home later than usual. She tossed her purse onto the counter and let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing at her temples. Mark took a sip of his beer, waiting. "I went out with Jason again," she said finally, not looking at him. Mark raised an eyebrow. "And?" She let out a bitter laugh. "And he's an arrogant ass. He spent the entire night talking about himself. He barely even asked me a single question. God, I don't even know why I bothered." Mark leaned back against the couch, studying her. "Maybe you expected too much." She shot him a sharp look, and for the first time, he saw it. The doubt creeping into her expression. The realization that maybe she had made a mistake. "He was good-looking," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "But I didn't feel anything." Mark didn't respond. He let her words linger in the space between them, let her sit with the weight of what she was saying. She had expected this to be fun, to be liberating. But instead it was just exhausting, and she didn't know that while she was chasing something new, Mark was already slipping away. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. He didn't even need to look to know who it was. Sophie. She had sent. Simple message. "Hey, are you free tomorrow night? I want to talk." He hesitated for only a moment before responding. "Yeah. Where?" Her reply was instant. "Meet me at Al's. 8 p.m. He set his phone down, his mind already spinning. He knew what this was. He knew what it could turn into, and yet, he wasn't stopping it. The next night, Mark sat across from Sophie in the dimly lit bar, the air between them thick with unspoken words. She looked different tonight, her usual easy confidence replaced by something more serious, more deliberate. "I know this is wrong," she said softly, swirling her drink in her glass, "but I can't stop thinking about it." Neither could he. Sophie looked up at him then, her dark eyes searching his. "What if she loses you, Mark?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He could have lied, could have played it off, could have told her that he didn't know. But the truth was, he did know. She already had. Before he could stop himself, he reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Sophie inhaled sharply, but didn't pull away. Instead, she curled her fingers around his, holding on to him, like she had been waiting for this moment all along. And then he kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't hesitant. It was desperate, reckless. The kind of kiss that came with years of feeling unseen, years of being taken for granted. Sophie melted into him, her hands tangling in his hair as he pulled her closer, as if she had been waiting for this just as much as he had. By the time they pulled away, both of them breathless, there was no more pretending. Mark had made his choice, and for the first time in years, he felt free. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers running through his hair as the weight of what had just happened settled over him. The air still held the faint scent of Sophie's perfume, and he could feel the warmth of her presence lingering beside him. She was curled up against his side, her fingers tracing slow, absent-minded patterns over his skin. He should have felt guilty. He should have been overwhelmed with regret. But all he felt was relief, a quiet, undeniable sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. Olivia had spent so much time convinced that she was in control of everything. She had been so sure that this arrangement would work in her favor, that she would have the freedom to explore without consequences, that Mark would simply wait in the background while she indulged in the excitement she had been craving. But she had been wrong. She hadn't considered that he might find something real. She hadn't prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't just sit there, alone, waiting for her to come home. And now, as he sat beside Sophie, he realized something he had been too afraid to acknowledge before. He didn't belong to Olivia anymore. Maybe he hadn't for a long time. Sophie shifted beside him, her voice soft in the dim light. "Are you okay?" He exhaled, staring down at his hands for a moment before glancing at her. "Yeah, I think so." She studied him for a moment, her dark eyes filled with something unreadable. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to, Mark. I don't want you to feel like—" He cut her off before she could finish. "I know what I'm doing, Sophie." She hesitated, but then nodded. There was something in the way she looked at him, something different from Olivia. Olivia had always assumed she knew him, had always treated him like an extension of herself, someone she could predict, someone she could control. But Sophie saw him. She listened. She didn't assume, and that alone made him realize just how much he had been missing. The next morning, Olivia still wasn't home. She had gone out the night before, likely on another date that would leave her feeling empty, another attempt at grasping something that had already slipped through her fingers. And for the first time, Mark didn't care. He wasn't waiting for her anymore. He wasn't wondering what she was doing, who she was with, or whether she would come home with that same smug confidence she had in the beginning. Because while she had been searching for something better, he had already found it. Sophie's texts came more frequently now, and Mark didn't hesitate to answer. He didn't feel the need to hide his phone, didn't feel the guilt that should have come with sneaking around. He wasn't sneaking. He wasn't lying. He was simply doing what Olivia had asked for, and yet somehow, he knew this wasn't what she had expected. Late one evening, while Olivia was still out, Sophie sent him a message. "Can I see you tonight?" He didn't think twice before responding. "Yeah. Come over." When she arrived, she hesitated at the door for just a moment before stepping. Sighed. There was a quiet understanding between them now, something unspoken but undeniable. She was here because she wanted to be, and so was he. She stood in the doorway, her eyes searching his. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." That night, as they lay together, Sophie whispered something against his skin that he knew he would never forget. "You deserve to be loved, Mark." He closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. Maybe that was the difference. Maybe that was why this felt so different from anything he had ever had with Olivia. Because with Sophie, it wasn't a game. It wasn't about control or power or proving something. It was real. The next morning, Olivia finally came home. Mark was already awake, drinking his coffee at the kitchen table when she walked in. She looked exhausted, her shoulders tense, her movements slower than usual. She barely looked at him as she set her purse down and sighed. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice calm. She let out a dry laugh, running a hand through her hair. "You could say that." Mark just nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He could see it written all over her face. This wasn't what she wanted anymore. This wasn't fun. This wasn't exciting. It was just exhausting. And for the first time, she seemed to realize that she might have made a mistake. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for a moment she hesitated. "You seem different." Mark met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Do I?" She nodded slowly, studying him like she was trying to figure out something she should have already known. "Yeah, you do." He didn't say anything. He just let the silence stretch between them, letting her feel the weight of what she had done, of what she had lost. And as he sat there, watching her struggle to understand how things had shifted, he realized something else. She wasn't in control anymore, and she never had been. Olivia had always been confident. It was one of the things that had drawn Mark to her in the first place, the way she carried herself, the way she always seemed so sure of her place in the world. She had never been the type to second-guess herself, never been the type to doubt. But now, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, she looked different. The smugness that had once been so present in her expression was gone. The light that used to dance in her eyes when she spoke about her newfound freedom had dimmed. And for the first time since this whole thing started, she looked uncertain. Mark didn't say anything at first. He just watched her, letting the silence between them stretch. He could see the way she was processing things, the way she was trying to piece together something that had already fallen apart. She had thought she would be winning by now. She had thought she would have everything she wanted, her marriage, her excitement, her options. But instead, she had ended up with nothing. And it was only now, only when she felt the shift, that she seemed to realize it. She let out a slow breath, drumming her fingers against the table. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice quieter than usual. "About us." Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. He wanted her to keep talking, wanted to see where this was going. She hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip for a moment before continuing. She exhaled, shaking her head. I don't know if this is working. He almost laughed, almost. Instead, he just tilted his head slightly. You don't know? She glanced at him, eyes searching his, as if trying to gauge whether or not he was mocking her. I thought this would be good for us, she admitted. I thought maybe we just needed something different, something to shake things up. Mark nodded, but he didn't let her off the hook so easily. And? Her lips pressed together. And it's not what I expected. That at least was the truth. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way she had stopped bringing up her dates, in the way she had started looking at him differently, like she was starting to understand that she had never actually been in control of any of this. She had thought she would be the one with the advantage. She had thought he would be the one struggling. But now, with the way things had played out, with the way he had changed, she was the one who felt like she was losing. Mark leaned, back in his chair, his expression unreadable. So what now? She swallowed, glancing down at the table. Maybe we should just go back to the way things were. He didn't answer right away. He let the words hang there, let them settle between them. Once, a long time ago, he might have jumped at the chance to fix things. He might have tried to salvage what they had, might have convinced himself that they could go back. But now, sitting here, looking at her, he realized something. He didn't want to. It wasn't just about what had happened between him and Sophie, though that had certainly played a role. It wasn't just about the betrayal, the choices, the lies. It was about something bigger than that. It was about the fact that Olivia had never really seen him, never really valued him. She had spent so much time believing he would always be there, so much time assuming he would never leave, that she had never once considered what it would mean if he did. And now, as she sat across from him, waiting for him to tell her they could fix this, waiting for him to reassure her, he realized that he didn't have it in him to do that anymore. He set his coffee cup down, meeting her gaze. I don't think we can. The way her face fell, the way her shoulders stiffened, told him everything he needed to know. She hadn't been expecting that. She had been expecting resistance, a fight, maybe even anger. But she hadn't been expecting indifference. She swallowed. Mark, I mean it, Olivia, he interrupted. I don't think we can go back. I don't think I want to. Silence. Long, heavy, suffocating silence. She blinked, her eyes darting across his face like she was trying to make sense of what was happening. But we've been together for years. I know. We've been through so much. I know. Her breath hitched. Then why? Mark exhaled, rubbing his thumb along the edge of the table. Because I deserve better than this. And honestly, so do you. Her lips parted slightly like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Maybe because she knew, deep down, that he was right. Maybe because she had felt it too, the way things had shifted, the way they had unraveled past the point of repair. She had been so focused on winning that she had never stopped to consider what she was losing, and now it was too late. She pushed her chair back, standing abruptly. I need some air. Mark just nodded. He didn't try to stop her, he didn't try to call her back. He just watched as she walked away, disappearing out the front door without another word, and for the first time since this whole thing had started, he felt free. Mark sat alone in the dimly lit living room staring at the ceiling. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now felt heavier than ever. He had spent the last week trying to figure out what he was supposed to feel. Anger, regret, relief. But none of those emotions settled in his chest the way he expected them to. Instead, there was just an odd sense of finality. Like something had been severed, something he wasn't sure could ever be mended. It had been 3 days since Olivia had walked out. She hadn't packed her bags or slammed the door on her way out. She had simply left, needing space, needing time. Maybe she thought that if she stepped away for a little while, things would make sense. Maybe she thought that when she came back, he'd be waiting for her, ready to talk, ready to fix whatever had broken between them. But the truth was, Mark didn't know if he wanted to fix it at all. The thought should have scared him. This was his wife, the woman he had built a life with, the woman he had once believed he would grow old beside. And yet as he sat there, replaying the events of the past few weeks, he couldn't shake the realization that this wasn't love anymore. Maybe it hadn't been for a long time. Love was supposed to be something you nurtured, something you protected. But Olivia had treated it like a game, like a puzzle to be rearranged whenever it suited her. She had thought she could set the rules, decide when and how they would redefine their marriage, without ever considering how he felt about it. She had expected him to accept, to wait, to watch as she explored a world she had convinced herself would be full of excitement and endless possibilities. She had assumed that no matter what, he would always be there in the end. But she had been wrong. He exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face, exhaustion pressing into his bones. The last few weeks had forced him to confront truths he had spent years avoiding. He had spent so much time being what Olivia needed, making sure she was happy, that he had never stopped to ask himself if he was happy. And now, looking back, he realized how often he had put himself second, how often he had made excuses for the way she treated him, the way she dismissed his needs. It had always been about her, what she wanted, what she felt, what she was missing. She had never once asked if he felt the same, and that was why he wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter, he was just done. His phone vibrated on the table beside him, breaking the silence. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Olivia had been calling him all day, leaving messages that he hadn't listened to. Maybe she had finally realized what she had lost. Maybe she was ready to apologize, to tell him that she had made a mistake. But Mark knew better. This wasn't about regret, it was about control. Olivia had never been the type to let something slip through her fingers without a fight. And right now, that's what he was to her, a loose thread. She was trying to pull back into place, but he didn't want to be pulled back. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a choice. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just reacting to Olivia's decisions. He was making his own. And that choice, as terrifying as it was, felt liberating. He picked up his phone, staring at the screen as it vibrated in his hand. Could answer. He could let her say whatever it was she needed to say. But what would be the point? He already knew how this conversation would go. She would try to explain, try to rationalize, try to convince him that they could still fix this. She would promise things would be different, that she had realized what she wanted. But deep down, Mark knew that Olivia wasn't fighting for him. She was fighting for control, and he wasn't going to give it to her. The phone stopped ringing, and a moment later, the screen lit up with a new voicemail. He let it sit there, untouched as he leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly. It was over. Maybe not in the way Olivia wanted, maybe not in a way that felt satisfying or dramatic, but in the quiet, in the stillness of the house. Mark felt the weight of their marriage lift off his shoulders, and for the first time in a long time he felt free. Mark stood at the edge of the driveway, staring at the house he had once called home. It looked the same. White shutters, a neatly trimmed lawn, the small wind chime Olivia had hung by the front door years ago, still swaying in the evening breeze. But the house didn't feel the same. It felt like a place he had outgrown, like a life that no longer fit him. It had been weeks since she walked out, and he had spent every day since then trying to piece together how things had gone so wrong. Maybe, in some way, they had been unraveling for years, slowly, quietly, so subtly that neither of them had noticed until the threads holding them together had finally snapped. Or maybe they had noticed, but neither of them had wanted to be the first to say it out loud. And now, standing here, he realized that was the real tragedy, not the betrayal, not the heartbreak, but the slow decay of something that had once been full of love. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he glanced at the front door. He had come back for the last of his things, though most of what mattered to him had already been packed away. The furniture, the framed pictures, the little reminders of their life together. None of it felt like his anymore. It felt like leftovers from someone else's story, a past he was no longer a part of. When he stepped inside, the air smelled the same. Lavender and vanilla, Olivia's favorite scent. But the warmth was gone. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the echoes of a home that had once been filled with laughter, conversations that stretched late into the night, whispers of dreams they had once built together. But that was before. Before she had decided she needed something more. Before she had convinced herself that love should be an open-ended question rather than a promise. He walked through the living room, past the couch where they had spent so many evenings together, past the dining table where they had shared countless meals, past the hallway where their wedding photo used to hang. It had been taken down now, replaced by an empty space on the wall, like a wound that had finally started to heal. He wasn't sure if she had removed it, or if it had simply disappeared in the process of trying to erase what they once were. Either way, the absence of it was telling. As he made his way to the bedroom, he noticed a box sitting on the floor, neatly packed, labeled with his name. Olivia had always been meticulous, even in the end. He crouched down, running his fingers over the cardboard flaps before opening it. Inside were a few books, a sweatshirt he had thought he lost, a handful of letters they had written to each, other back when love had been effortless. He picked up one of them, the edges slightly worn, his own handwriting scrawled across the envelope. He hesitated before pulling out the letter, unfolding it carefully. The words on the page felt like they belonged to someone else, a version of himself who had once believed in forever. Olivia, I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. You are my home. Wherever life takes us, as long as I have you, I have everything I need. He let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. It was almost cruel how time had a way of turning certainty into irony. He had meant every word when he wrote it, and maybe in some way she had believed them too. But people changed. Love changed. And sometimes, no matter how much you tried to hold on, you had to let go. Carefully, he folded the letter and placed it back into the box. He didn't need to take it with him. He didn't need to carry the past any longer. He stood up, taking one last look around. There was no sadness, no regret, just a quiet understanding that this chapter had ended. And maybe that was okay. Maybe love wasn't about holding on at all costs, but about knowing when to walk away with dignity. As he walked out the door, the wind chime rattled softly behind him, the sound fading as he stepped off the porch. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, Mark wasn't leaving something behind. He was moving forward. Ethan sat alone in his new apartment, the hum of the city beyond his window, a distant echo of the life he had left behind. The space was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it were waiting for something. Laughter, conversation, the familiar sound of Olivia's voice filling the gaps. But those days were gone, and the silence was all that remained. He ran a hand over the wooden table in front of him, the only piece of furniture that had made the move from their home. It had scratches along the edges, remnants of years spent together. Dinners filled with stories, mornings where they sipped coffee in comfortable silence, late nights spent arguing over the little things that somehow felt bigger than they were. He traced the marks absent-mindedly, remembering how Olivia would always sit on the left side, closest to the kitchen, her fingers drumming softly against the surface as she spoke. It was strange how a piece of furniture could hold so much history, how an object could remember when people so easily forgot. A deep sigh left his lips as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had spent weeks trying to untangle the mess of emotions inside him, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything had started to change. Maybe it had been gradual, like a slow leak in a boat that no one notices until it's too late. Or maybe it had been sudden, a sharp shift in the air that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Either way, the outcome was the same. He had lost her, or maybe she had lost him. Didn't really matter anymore. He reached for his phone, scrolling through old messages, stopping at the last one she had sent. It was simple, almost too casual for what it signified. Take care of yourself, Ethan. No long explanation, no desperate attempt to salvage what was broken. just a quiet goodbye disguised as something polite. He had stared at those words for too long, searching for something between the lines, something that might hint at regret, hesitation, a second chance. But there was nothing, just finality. It was funny how people could go from everything to nothing so quickly. How someone you once built your world around could become a stranger with just a few words. He had read somewhere that the brain takes a long time to catch up to reality, that it still seeks out what is familiar even after it's gone. And maybe that was why he still reached for the other side of the bed in the morning. Why he still expected to hear her key in the door, even though he knew she wasn't coming back. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the memories. They didn't leave. They lingered in the smallest things, in the way he made his coffee, in the scent of lavender that still clung to some of his clothes, in the songs that played on the radio at the wrong moments. People always talked about moving on like it was an action, like it was something you could just decide to do. But no one ever warned you about the in-between, about the long, quiet spaces where the past still felt too close and the future felt too far. Ethan closed his eyes, letting his head fall back against the chair. He knew eventually the weight of her absence would lessen. Eventually the memories would become just that, memories rather than constant reminders. And maybe one day, he would sit at this table with someone new, someone who would fill the silence with laughter, someone whose presence wouldn't feel like an echo of something lost. But not yet. For now, he would let himself feel it. The emptiness, the longing, the ache of what once was. Not because he wanted to, but because it was the only way forward. Because the only way to truly move on wasn't to forget, but to remember without breaking. Ethan placed his phone face down on the table and exhaled. It was time to stop looking back. The moment Ethan stepped into his childhood home for the first time in years, he felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and discomfort settle in his chest. Everything looked the same. The worn-out couch where his mother used to sit with a cup of tea, the dining table that had seen countless family dinners, and the old clock on the wall that still ticked a little too loudly. But something felt different, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something unspoken to be acknowledged. His mother greeted him at the door with a soft smile, but there was something in her eyes, something knowing, something careful. She had always been perceptive, always able to read the emotions he tried to bury beneath a steady voice and composed expression. He knew she had heard about the breakup. News traveled fast in families, especially when it came to something as significant as the end of a long relationship. "I made your favorite," she said, leading him into the kitchen. The smell of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes filled the air, the same meal she had cooked for him on birthdays, on bad days, on days when the world felt too heavy. It was a simple gesture, but it was one that told him more than words ever could. She knew he was hurting, and this was her way of telling him he wasn't alone. As they sat down at the table, his father walked in, his usual quiet presence filling the room. Unlike his mother, his father wasn't one for words. He didn't ask questions he knew Ethan wasn't ready to answer, didn't offer forced reassurances or empty platitudes. Instead, he simply patted Ethan's shoulder as he took a seat, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had been left unsaid. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds coming from the clinking of silverware against plates. Felt almost normal, almost like the weight of the past few months wasn't pressing down on Ethan's chest like an anchor. But then, his mother's voice broke through the quiet. "She called me," she said softly, setting down her fork. Ethan's hand tightened around his glass. He didn't have to ask who she was talking about. Olivia. His mother's expression was careful, like she was treading on fragile ground. "She just wanted to make sure you were okay," she added, as if that detail would soften the impact of the words. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse." His mother studied him for a moment before nodding, as if she understood more than he was saying. Maybe she did. She had seen it all. The way he had loved Olivia, the way he had built a future around her, the way he had unraveled when it all came crashing down. "People don't just stop caring overnight," she said gently. "Even when things end, it doesn't mean the love disappears immediately." Ethan let out a dry laugh. Then what's the point of ending it at all? His father, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. His voice was steady, low. "Because sometimes love isn't enough to keep two people together." Ethan looked up, surprised by the weight of those words. His father had always been a man of few emotions, someone who believed in perseverance, in commitment, in fighting for what mattered. But there was no fight in his voice now, only a quiet acceptance, as if he knew from experience what it meant to love someone and still have to let them go. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt the sharp edges of his grief soften just a little. Maybe his father was right. Maybe love wasn't always about holding on. Sometimes it was about knowing when to let go. The rest of the evening passed with lighter conversation, talk of work, of childhood memories, of things that had, nothing to do with heartbreak. And when Ethan left that night, stepping back into the cold air, he realized something. He had spent so much time trying to make sense of what happened, trying to hold on to the version of his life that no longer existed. But maybe it was time to stop searching for closure in a place where there was none. Maybe some things weren't meant to be understood, only accepted. As he drove away from the house, he found himself breathing a little easier. The pain was still there, lingering beneath the surface, but it no longer felt like it was consuming him. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to let go. Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never asked for, often in ways we never expected. Ethan thought love was something that, once found, would last forever if he held on to it tightly enough. But what he learned was that love is not just about persistence. It's about timing, growth, and understanding when to fight and when to walk away. It's about knowing that even the deepest connections don't always align with the paths we take, and sometimes letting go is the hardest but most necessary form of love. One of the greatest mistakes we make is believing that if something is meant to be, it will be effortless. But real love, real relationships require work, patience, and sacrifice. And yet, even with all of that, some things are simply not meant to last forever. That doesn't mean they weren't real, that they didn't matter, or that they didn't shape us into who we are. It just means they had an expiration date, and holding on to them beyond that only leads to pain. Ethan's story is one that many of us can relate to. We have all loved someone who, at one point, felt like home, only to watch them become a stranger. We have all found ourselves clinging to a version of our lives that no longer fits, hoping that if we just try harder, we can make it work. But the truth is, love is not about forcing something to stay when it no longer belongs. It's about cherishing what it was, learning from it, and moving forward with the understanding that some chapters are not meant to continue, no matter how much we wish they would. If there's anything to take away from this, it's that healing is not about forgetting. It's about accepting. It's about allowing yourself to grieve what was while embracing what can be. It's about understanding that your worth is not defined by who stays or who leaves, but by the strength you find in yourself to move forward. Have you ever had to let go of someone you thought would always be in your life? How did you find the strength to move on? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that touch the heart and remind us of the lessons life teaches us along the way.